Good evening and welcome to the Fathering Channel to tonight's webinar, which is on Will the COVID-19 pandemic make the next generation more resilient? This is a pre-recorded webinar as we are very happy to welcome tonight an international speaker, Dr. Carolyn FitzGerald, who's joining us all the way from Canada. We want to say thank you to those who sent in early questions. We did get quite a few, and we will try to get through as many of those as we can in tonight's webinar. The format will be a 30-minute approximately webinar, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. But before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about our very esteemed guest tonight, our international speaker from Canada, Dr. Carolyn FitzGerald. Dr. FitzGerald received her PhD in clinical psychology from the Western University in Ontario, Canada in 2002 and her MA in clinical psychology in 1994. She is an assistant professor and the graduate coordinator in the Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University and teaches courses in the graduate and undergraduate programs in the Faculty of Education in the areas of quantitative research, methodology, learning theories, and child development, and equality and diversity. We are very happy to have her tonight. We welcome her subject and her discussion on making children's resilience the lasting legacy of this pandemic.
All right, well, thank you very, very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. As has been said, our topic for tonight is making children's resilience the lasting legacy of this pandemic. So I've been invited to talk about ideas for how we can grow and strengthen children's resilience during this pandemic. And I'm really, really excited to be here and talk about this. So I don't know that I need to add too much more to the introduction of who I am, except I will add that I also teach mental health courses in our Bachelor of Education program. I teach a mental health course to our graduate students, and I also offer a mental health certificate for educators who are working from kindergarten to grade 12. So that's a project that I started a number of years ago, and it began with educators in our immediate local area, quickly expanded beyond to our province, now across Canada, and we have a number of people from other countries around the world who participate in this project. So as you can see from the picture on the screen, here's professional polished me. Back in the days when I used to go to an office to go to a work, when we used to get dressed from the waist up and the waist down to go to work. But of course, those are not these times right now. And so I thought I'd share a little bit about me during the pandemic. So no word of a lie, early on in the pandemic, there was a morning when I tripped down the stairs, managed to fall flat on my face. While cooking porridge, I actually managed to get porridge to explode out of the pot, which is no mean feat. Then left a frying pan on the stove, so that got nice and black. And later that night, while roasting a chicken in the oven for dinner, I looked behind me through the glass in the oven door and noticed that the oven was actually on fire. So generally speaking, I'm fairly competent in the kitchen. So this is not the usual me. However, it's very much me during a pandemic. We know from studies about how we respond to stress and trauma that prolonged stress impacts our brain circuitry. It impacts how our brain functions. In an immediate and short-term crisis, as in the early days of the pandemic, the amygdala in our brain gets triggered, and that serves as kind of an alarm system that makes us extra aware of threats in our environment. So even if we wanted to take a mental break from thinking about the coronavirus, the amygdala makes it very hard for us to do that. Also, when we're focused on things like our worry and anxiety, it kind of gets in the way. It kind of eats up our resources for things like paying attention or concentrating. And now that we're 3 months into this crisis, our metabolisms and our energy regulating circuits are also likely to be affected. So that makes us automatically put more resources into survival mode. So it means that we need more sleep and we feel extra tired when we don't get enough sleep. We tend to have much quicker emotional reactions, and we tend to rely on previously learned ways of coping rather than being able to try new and creative ways of coping with the crisis. So it can also mean that we even have extra cravings for sweet or high-fat foods, because biologically speaking, that's a good thing to help us get through a short-term crisis. We can expect that most of us are going to experience at least some of these typical signs and symptoms of dealing with major ongoing stressors. So you might be experiencing physical things like more headaches or a more sensitive stomach. You might be having sleep problems. You might be feeling distracted and difficulty concentrating or feeling anxious. Maybe your relationships aren't quite as smooth as they normally are. You might have difficulty managing your emotions, and you might not be feeling fully present. I like to share the difficulties that I've experienced during this pandemic because I think we need to talk about how hard this is. Otherwise, we run the danger of thinking that our struggles are unique to us, when in fact the very opposite is the case. So one of the analogies that we have been using to talk about the pandemic is this idea that although we all might be in the same storm, we're all in a different boat. And so what your boat feels like on any given day can be very different from somebody else's boat. But I think that we also need to recognize the strengths and the benefits in our boats. And I'll circle back to this towards the end. So a really important question for you to ask yourself is, what is something unexpected and positive that you've learned from coping with this pandemic? In other words, what's working well in your boat? I'm teaching a graduate course right now called Mental Health Foundations for Educational Leaders. And I start every single class with a question like this. What's something unexpected and positive you've learned? What's something that you've learned that you want to keep post-pandemic? What's a new habit that you've acquired that is actually working really well in your life? What's something you've learned to appreciate about your community? It's important that we focus on the things that are going right to kind of counterbalance all the stress and the difficulties of that stress in our lives. From my own perspective, I know that I'm really grateful to have a reliable internet connection. I'm really grateful to have my own office at my home. I know not everybody does, and that's making working at home really hard for many. On most days, I'm thankful for the extra time with my teenage boys. I have a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old. And I'm especially grateful for the really sophisticated ways in which we can now communicate with each other via the internet or via social media. I think that that's helped us maintain social connections in a way that just simply was not possible a few decades ago, and certainly not possible during the last pandemic. But of course, this doesn't mean that the boat makes the storm easy to ride. And in some days, the waves might seem a little bigger and the boat might seem a little smaller. And so it's important that we also think about what's things that are difficult for us to manage during the pandemic. So as much as we need to think about what's working well, we also need to be open to acknowledging the things that aren't working quite as well. And I think it's also important not to compare your experience to somebody else. The pandemic, everybody is going to experience the pandemic very differently. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who's an introvert, and at the beginning of this pandemic, he loved the fact that he was working at home and he had so much more time on his own. It worked really well for him. He felt really healthy being able to be in that environment. And then his partner had to work from home, and she works in a call center. So she was doing call center work. So she was on the phone talking all day long. And all of a sudden, this friend of mine was not coping nearly as well. Friends of mine who are extroverts are having a particularly difficult time because they're not getting their needs met through that social interaction. So everybody's a little bit different. And this is really important for us to keep in mind when we start thinking about our children, because children are having unique challenges during this pandemic. It might be unique because of their ages, it might be unique because of their personalities, it might be unique because of their home context. If I was to try and put myself in the shoes of my older son and my younger son, I know that they're having shared experiences, but also very different experiences in the pandemic. And so it's important that we don't make assumptions about the kind of challenges our children are facing, and that we are able to have conversations about them, about the things that are going with them, about the things that are going well and the things that are not so easy to do as well. Okay, so if you've been paying attention to things that are posted on the internet, if you subscribe to a newspaper or radio, listen to a radio show or watch blog posts, you might have noticed that resilience is a topic that has appeared with greater and greater frequency over the last couple of months. The titles that you see on the screen here are just some examples of titles that I pulled from journal articles, from magazine articles, from blogs. And I think that there's a reason why we've been talking so much more about resilience lately. And that's going to be, I'm going to try and explain why I think resilience is such an important and timely topic right now. But first, I think it makes sense that I offer you a definition of resilience. So very simply, we can define resilience as how well a person can adapt to events in their lives when faced with a tragedy, a natural disaster, a health concern, relationship, work, or school problem. Well, given the current threat of COVID-19 to our health, our ability to work, our ability to send our children and youth to school, and the tragic death of so many people around the world, every single one of us is challenged in regards to how we adapt and respond to the current crisis. So this means that we have the key ingredient for building resilience. We have a very challenging experience. So no wonder we've been talking more and more about resilience. So let's talk a little bit more about why a major challenge or stressor is so important to building resilience. I've put together this graphic to explain the connection between experiencing challenges and building resilience. So when we experience a stressor, automatically, without thinking about it, we respond to that stressor in some way. Sometimes we make a more deliberate, more conscious choice, sometimes less so. Regardless, when we experience a stressor, we respond to that stressor. And then we get to experience the outcome of our response. We get to see what happens because of this response we chose in regards to the stressor. And again, this is an automatic process. We evaluate our response. We don't even have to think about it, but deep within our brain, there's an evaluation process that happens. We evaluate the pros and cons to that response. So what that means is we learn something about how we responded to that stressor. And the results of that evaluation get stored as information in our memory. So then when we experience a new stressor, we tend to apply the strategies that work, and we tend to avoid the strategies that don't work. And round we go. So every time we experience a stressor, we acquire new learning that helps us better respond to future stressors. So clearly, challenging experiences are necessary for building resilience. So we do our children no favor at all by protecting them from all of life's challenges. I know this wouldn't apply to all parts of Australia, but it certainly does apply to all parts of Canada. But sometimes we talk about snowplow parenting. And snowplow parenting is when we, it's like driving a snowplow through thick snow. We pave the way, we clear the snow out of the way so our children have a free and easy path from which to walk their life. But unfortunately, we cannot protect our children from all of life's challenges. And so we do them no favors by not giving them opportunities to learn how to respond effectively and adaptively to those life stressors. So that's why it's really important that we allow our children to experience some of those stressors. Now, I would also add, though, that one of the major myths of building resilience is that facing a challenge is sufficient to build resilience. It's not. After all, we all know people who thrive in the face of crisis and others who sink under the weight of adversity. With babies, it's a little bit more obvious. We know that we need to attend to their needs and wants, that babies are very much dependent on us. But sometimes it's harder to figure out with children and youth what they need. We don't always know what we should offer, when we should offer, how much we should offer. But I think we have to find the balance, because if we step back too much and just let them figure it out entirely on their own, we might be missing opportunities to help build resilience in our children. So if facing a challenge is only one of the necessary ingredients to building resilience, let's spend the rest of our time together talking about what else we can add to the mix to help tip the favors in terms of building resilience and as an outcome for our children and youth. Okay, so let's talk about how we set the stage for building resilience. There's a great deal of research that clearly demonstrates that young people tend to be more resilient to life challenges when they feel loved, cared for, and supported. So I would say that now more than ever, our young people need to experience their family as caring, sensitive, and responsive to their needs. We can certainly convey this with our words, but there's lots of other concrete actions we can take to communicate that idea of we've got this. So let's break this down. First of all, there are ways in which we can structure our homes to encourage and foster resilience. Key factors that I'd like to identify are organization and routines for consistency, predictability, and regularity. And when we're talking about routines, we're also talking about the kind of rules that help to build resilience in our children. And some of this might surprise you, but I'll see if I can explain why this might actually help to build resilience in our children. So, organization. The big idea here is that organized spaces convey a sense of order and calm. In other words, organized spaces provide a safe haven from the chaos in the outer world. So what's important about that is children are much better able to adapt and respond to chaos when they see it as unusual. They see that as different from their normal day-to-day experience. So if they have a safe haven in their home that feels calm and feels organized, it serves as an antidote to the chaos that's happening in their outer lives or in the other parts of their lives. And if organization or organizing your health makes you feel better, then this is a great opportunity to use this strategy to build resilience in your children. But if it's not your thing, it's probably not going to do you or your children any good if it makes you feel more stressed that you need to keep your house pristine. That's certainly not the case at all. It's more than sufficient to try and keep sleeping areas and eating areas calm, predictable, and organized. So if you can manage that task, then we're offering our children a break from the world crisis that's in front of us right now. Routines are also really important. The big idea here is that routines give children a sense of predictability, stability, and regularity. So again, this serves as another antidote to the disruption in their lives. So even though they're not doing the things that they're normally like to do, it doesn't mean they can't have that sense of predictability and stability in our lives. And routines can do this. And routines don't have to be complicated. They don't have to occupy children every minute of the day. You have to decide for yourself what kind of routines make sense in your house. It may be sufficient that we eat dinner together every night. It might be sufficient that we play a family game together every night. It might be sufficient that you're expected to walk the dog every day in the afternoon. You're expected in the morning to get up, make your bed, get dressed, brush your teeth, right? All the things that we don't always think about doing if we don't have to leave the house. But if we set these expectations and set these routines for our children, again, it really helps them cope with the disruption in their lives. As I mentioned earlier, part of routines is rules. Consistent and fair rules are really important to our children too. Again, rules serve to bring structure to children's lives and combat that disruption in their outer lives. It's really important at this time more than ever that the rules are reasonable and fair. If you want to limit your children's screen time, it's not going to mean much if you're glued to the screen or the news 24 hours a day. So we have to lead by example. So whatever rules we set and routines we set for our children, it's important that we are willing to follow those rules and routines as well. So word to the wise, make sure the rules and routines that you set make sense for you as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we foster habits for resilience. So we've talked about setting the stage for building resilience, things we can do in our home, but let's talk a little bit about how we can foster habits for resilience. The key habits that I want to talk about today are positivity and self-efficacy. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. Okay, with positivity. The big idea here is that positivity is an important factor that contributes to resilience after disasters. We know this from a number of different research studies that folks who have greater positivity in their thinking and in their attitudes tend to respond and recover from disasters much faster than others. Importantly, positivity doesn't mean that you bury your head in the sand and you pretend that all is well in the world. Rather, it means that we have a balanced and accurate understanding of everything that's happening in the world. So if you think back to the beginning of this webinar, I asked you to think about things that are going well in your boat, what's good about your boat, as well as the things that are difficult, the things that you're struggling with. So that's the balance that we're looking for that tends to lead us towards positivity. One of the things that we often talk about in our house is that I don't know if Australia has ever experienced food shortages in this crisis, but there was a time when it was difficult to get things like flour, toilet paper, and eggs in our grocery store. I think people were engaging in a little bit of panic buying. But you know, we'd often say in our house, well, just because there's no eggs in the grocery store today, it doesn't mean the chickens are going to stop laying eggs. The chickens are not affected by this pandemic. So we need to not panic that there's a lack of eggs at our grocery store. So that's the kind of balanced view that's really, really helpful. And the best way in which we can encourage this in our children is by role modeling it. So we have to be really deliberate, obvious, and clear in our efforts to be more positive. And if it's one thing I would want everybody to know about positivity, is this is a skill that you can build in yourself. You don't need to be born an optimistic person. You can train yourself to be more positive simply by being more conscious of what you pay attention to and what you focus on and what you speak about. And so if we want to encourage that trait in our children, then we need to be able to be a role model for our children. And the really great news about this is when you train yourself to be a more positive thinker, it feels really great for your mental health as well. So what's good for the children is also really good for the dads. All right, the second key habit that I want to talk about is self-efficacy. So the big idea here is that when we encourage our children to take on new challenges, and again, when we serve as a role model for allowing our children to try new things, and when we are a role model for when things go wrong, those are all ways in which we can build the self-efficacy of children. So when we talk about self-efficacy, we're talking about our belief in our abilities, especially our ability to succeed when challenged. So we can help children and youth develop a strong sense of self-efficacy for coping with the current crisis by supporting their own efforts to take on new challenges and to succeed at those efforts. So perhaps they want to communicate with their parents via video chat or some kind of social media, but their grandparents have absolutely no idea how to do this. So if your children can teach, can coach their grandparents how to communicate via social media or some kind of video channel, then that's a great opportunity for building children's self-efficacy for coping with this crisis. As I mentioned earlier, young children also develop a sense of self-efficacy for coping by watching you do the same. So given the lack of flour and bread at our grocery store, lots of people have been resorting to making their own bread at home. Perhaps this is something that you want to try. And so if your children watch you attempting something new and learning how to do something new, that can also give them the courage and the idea to try something new themselves, and that can also really build their sense of self-efficacy for coping with this crisis. And I think it's also really important, perhaps the best opportunity for learning happens when we try something new and it's a complete disaster. It's an absolute flop. So if you bake bread and it turns out harder than a cement block, the wonderful thing that can happen with that is we can then role model for our children what happens or how to cope when things don't turn out as we initially anticipated. We can teach them perseverance. We can teach them how to learn from our mistakes. We can teach them how to pick up and try again. So I'd encourage you to really embrace those opportunities when you try something brand new and it's a disaster. That can be one of the absolute best learning opportunities and ways in which we can build self-efficacy for coping in our children. Okay, I'm just being mindful of the time here. So I want to circle back to some of the things that we talked about at the beginning. And we talked a lot. I hope I've encouraged you to think about how you're feeling, how you're coping, what this pandemic has been like for you, because it's critically important that when we're thinking about meeting our children's needs, that we also think about our own needs. In the early days of the crisis here in Canada, that was mid-March for us. I'm not entirely sure when it was in Australia. But one of the first major changes is that our schools shut down. In province after province after province, schools shut down and children were sent home. And it was very unclear in the early days as to what kind of schooling would happen or would not happen, how it would happen, how we would ensure that our children were getting their learning needs met in this pandemic. And there was a little bit of a panicked response from a number of parents. So soon this idea emerged that that we need to make a distinction between a global health crisis and a learning crisis. We need to remember that we do not have a learning crisis on our hands. That if our children miss a few weeks of school in the years and years of schooling that they will receive throughout their lives, it's not a crisis, it's not a problem. And so we don't need to run around trying to put in homeschooling and schooling resources and so on and so forth immediately. As the crisis has unfolded into the long term, we do, of course, need to attend to our children's learning needs, but we don't need to treat it as a crisis. We're going to do what we can do, and that's all that we can do. And we need to accept that it's more than enough. And I think this idea extends to other things that you want to try in your home. If you want to try keeping your home a little bit more organized, that's great, but we don't need to take it to the extreme. Our house doesn't have to be pristine and perfectly put away every day. It's not going to happen, and that's okay. There are days when you're going to be feeling up to facing new tasks, and days when you don't feel up to trying new tasks. And that's okay too. And so, excuse me, it's really important that we never lose sight of our own needs. If you've ever had a chance to travel on an airplane, you know that we are always taught to put on our own oxygen mask first so that we can help our children should we need to put on their oxygen mask in an emergency. It's hard to do. It's hard to attend to our own needs before our children's needs, but we're going to attend to our children's needs much better when we don't lose sight of our own needs and during this crisis. So as a final note, that's what I would really encourage everybody to do, is to make sure you put your own oxygen mask on first. Okay, so I think that leaves us some time for questions and hopefully some helpful answers.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was a really amazing run through on some wonderful strategies and ideas and advice that you have for us. There are a range of questions that we have. So the first one we have is from Joyce. So first of all, she says thank you as well. And she has 3 children under 12, and she's concerned about the long-term mental health of her children who have experienced many changes like homeschooling and extended holiday breaks, and wondering about how do you normalize these experiences? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that change in and of itself doesn't create mental health challenges in our young people. So yes, they're undergoing a great deal of change and upheaval right now, but that in and of itself doesn't necessarily cause long-term mental health problems. So we might feel really uncomfortable with change, but oftentimes children are far more adapted to change than we are. So we have to make sure we separate what our children are facing from what we're facing. I think it's really important that we think about the aspects of this crisis that we can normalize and aspects that we shouldn't normalize. I think it's okay to talk about the fact that this is an unusual period in our life, that this is an experience that they will learn from and remember and talk about probably throughout the rest of their lives. But this is certainly not the only time that humans have experienced a major change, a major upheaval. And the great news is every time the crisis has passed, the upheaval has settled down, and we've gotten back to living in a world with less upheaval and less crisis. It's never happened in time before where that upheaval has lasted forever. It doesn't. And we can sometimes, it's easier for parents to take the long view, but I think it's helpful to let our children know that yes, these are very unusual times, but they won't last forever. It may seem like a long time, but they won't, and then things will seem a little bit more stable.
That's great, thank you. We've got one here from Roger. So he's got older children. He's wondering what advice you may have and some go-to methods on dealing with kids who are experiencing some really strong emotions during the lockdown period we're going in and out of. So in Australia here, we have some of our places, some of our states that are going back into lockdown. Having come through it, they're now going back in. So he's noticing that his kids who are teenagers are finding the loss of social contact with their friends really hard.
I can relate to this one because I have a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old. We're just emerging from our lockdown, and one of the things that I've been trying to do all along is to let my teens know that there may be a second wave and we may have another lockdown period. But the good news is we got through it the first time, and we'll get through it the second time, and hopefully that will be the last time. But we can think about what we've learned from that first experience and see if that can help us cope a little bit better with a second wave, which might require a temporary lockdown. But one of the things that I think is really, really important and sometimes hard to do with teenagers is to simply accept how they're feeling. I've, when I think about my own teens, they've experienced anger and worry and frustration, and it's hard to hear. We like to make our children feel better, but sometimes we can make them feel better simply by listening and accepting their feelings and encouraging them to talk about their feelings. Because if they don't talk about their feelings, they tend to act out their feelings and sometimes take it out on you. And you can do that a little bit by role modeling, right? When you talk about, wow, if I ever had a rough day today, I'm feeling really frustrated, I'm feeling really tired of living in this pandemic, I'm really wishing that it was over. And so we're role modeling that it's okay to talk about how we're feeling, so we don't necessarily act it out. And the reality is teens should be spending time with their friends right now, and they're not. And that's a reality we have to accept, and we can't fix it, we can't change it. So one of the things that sometimes helps teens is to have a little bit more sense of control over their life, right? Because they can't do the things they want to do. So where can we give them a little bit better sense of control? We've done some heavy duty negotiation with our sons around what time they can sleep to, what time they should go to bed. And so we found some compromises in the middle, things that we can live with, things that they want to live with. And that's worked really well, because I think ultimately what we're doing is we are giving them some control, a sense of control and a sense of decision making at a time when so many decisions are being made for them. That can really turn things around.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive. So Peter is another question we've got, and his kids though are younger, so they're 5 and 9, and he's concerned about having the right words and even the right skills to manage the questions that his children are coming at him with. So how do you suggest he approaches this and discusses perhaps the positive aspects and that idea of resilience, bearing in mind that his children are quite young?
Yeah, they are quite young. So I think it's really important that we take the lead from children, that we let them ask the questions that they want to ask. And my tendency, especially with younger children, is to provide a little bit of information and let them tell me whether or not they want to hear more. So if they do want to hear more, they're going to ask for more questions, they're going to ask for more details. And then I trust that that means the young child is ready to hear more information. And that may be different from the 5-year-old and the 9-year-old. They probably have very different personalities. And so we need to take our cues from our children about what they're ready and wanting to hear. I don't know that we necessarily need to talk about and use the word resilient with a 5-year-old. That's a big word. It's a complicated concept, perhaps a little bit with a 9-year-old. But I think that we do better showing how to be resilient rather than talking about resilience with our children. So we do better by demonstrating what we hope for our children. I had a period when I was really frustrated with my teen school. My older child graduated from high school this year, and I didn't feel that that high school was doing enough to celebrate and acknowledge that major milestone in his life. And I finally had to give my head a shake and say, okay, I need to stop waiting for the school to do it and start showing my son how to do this. So we started talking about how would he want to celebrate? What can we do? Let's get creative, let's problem solve. And so the outcome of that was, I think he became a little bit more resilient to coping with his anxiety around not celebrating his graduation. But I did it by role modeling what I wanted from him. So hopefully that gives you some ideas that we don't necessarily have to find the right words. It's more powerful if we find the right actions.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the last question we have tonight, Carolyn. It's from Kate.
Okay.
So this is probably a tricky one. So how do we deal with the conversations our children are having about the possible loss of someone in the family?
Okay.
So they're very close to their grandparents, but they can't see them at the moment. And the children are very worried about them. And they're also worried about their kids getting sick or dying, their friends, sorry, getting sick or dying. So what advice and ideas would you put forward there?
Oh, I'm glad that was it Kate? I'm glad that Kate asked this question, because I think this is a
Yes,
this is a hard one, and really important for us to talk about, because it's natural, it's expected, and I think it's probably somewhat realistic that we worry about our loved ones getting sick and dying. I statistically, I think most of us will emerge from this crisis without having contracted coronavirus, certainly not all of us. Most of us will not lose a family member, but some of us will. And we can't pretend otherwise. I think it's really important, though, that sometimes we forget that how we understand and see and perceive the world is different from how children understand and perceive and see the world. And so we understand why we can't see our elderly parents or our grandparents at this time. We understand that there's a good reason for that, but we shouldn't assume that children also understand that. And so I think we need to be really deliberate and careful to make sure we explain how our actions are helping our friends, how our actions are helping our grandparents. So by staying away, we're helping to keep them safe. We're helping to ensure they don't pick up any germs, any viruses. So what we're doing is a positive. It's a really good thing that we're doing. So as I said, it might seem obvious to us as adults, but we shouldn't assume that it's obvious to children. And it might help children to understand that what they're doing is a really good thing. And then I might add to that, it's also really important to help children figure out how to connect with their grandparents. Because I think one of the things that perhaps Kate's children are saying is that I really miss seeing my grandparents. I really miss them. Okay, so how can we connect with them? Can we send them a letter? Can we send them a picture? Can we videotape us doing a funny skit and send it along? What other ways can we find to connect with our grandparents and our loved ones in our lives?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carolyn FitzGerald. It's been truly amazing and very interesting, your webinar tonight. And I think you've helped us all understand, one, how we can turn this more into a positive and help our children build resilience through this challenging time. But I think also the role of positivity in their life. It's important for all of us, but I think you've really shown us how important it is to have that positivity around our children. And we thank you very much for being with us and sharing your work with fathers, father figures, and parents here in Australia. For those of you that are listening and you'd like to become a subscriber to get any of our weekly tips, our information on our webinar series or podcasts, please go to the Fathering Project and just register and become a member, and we'll send you out information each month on our upcoming webinars. You can also call us. Information is on the screen. I think what I'd like to finish off by is saying thank you very much for those who got ahead and came and sent us some really wonderful questions for the webinars this week. We very much appreciate that. Coming up, we have in August a theme that we're working on, which is called bullying and cyberbullying, and we have a number of wonderful speakers who will be helping parents, our fathers and father figures, understand these subjects and also understand how to best deal with them with their children. Next week, we have our last in the series on resilience for this month with Assistant Professor Justine Gatt from University of New South Wales. So we'll hope you will join us next week. We wish you all the best for the rest of the week ahead and the weekend. Be safe and stay well. Thank you very much.